He was just a student, and she was a 61-year-old woman, also dark-skinned. Their marriage was ridiculed by everyone, but when she got pregnant, everyone was shocked. Subscribe and subscribe in the comments where you're watching this video from. The scent of antiseptic lingered faintly in the air, blending with the distant hum of television sets and the slow shuffle of slippered feet down sterile hallways. At Pine Ridge Senior Living, time moved differently. Days slid into one another like rain on glass, predictable, muted, and slow. For the residents who remained alert, it was a quiet kind of prison. For the others, it was simply where they existed until they no longer did. But for Evan Holloway, Pine Ridge was neither. It was work, and increasingly, it was an escape. At 22, Evan had already grown weary of expectations. Raised in the conservative town of Milledgeville, Georgia, by church-going parents who saw the world in black and white, he had long learned the cost of silence and the weight of being the good son. His father, a deacon with a commanding voice, believed in hard lines and firm discipline. His mother spoke less, but with equal precision, favoring duty over dreams and structure over soul. They believed in tradition, in a proper future for their only son, one paved with responsibility, marriage to a nice white girl from church, and medical school that would lead him to a respected life, preferably within 50 miles of home. Evan had tried. He had followed the rules, kept his head down, made the grades. He got into the University of Georgia's pre-med program and picked up a part-time job as an orderly at Pine Ridge to offset tuition costs without fully depending on his parents. But something had begun to gnaw at him, a quiet, persistent ache for more than what was expected. He couldn't name it yet. It showed itself in the books he hid in his backpack, in the long walks he took alone after class, in the way he lingered at Pine Ridge after his shift ended. It was during one of those lingering moments that he first saw her. She was sitting by the window in the recreation room, one ankle crossed neatly over the other, her hands resting on the arms of the wooden chair like a queen on her throne. She wasn't watching television like the others, nor was she asleep. Her eyes, dark and sharp, were fixed outside on something beyond the dusty glass. Her skin was deep brown, smooth despite the faint etchings of time. She wore a head wrap in burnt orange and gold and a long, flowing tunic that reminded Evan of sunlight and mangoes. She didn't look like she belonged there, not in the way the others did. He paused just long enough to be noticed. "Young man," she said, not turning her head, "I hope you're not planning to mop around me. I just got comfortable." Her voice was rich and unhurried, with the slightest trace of a rasp that hinted at years of laughter, or perhaps smoking, or both. Evan startled, then smiled despite himself. "No, ma'am," he replied, "just making rounds." She turned then, looked at him full on. Her eyes held no apology, only interest. "Good. I like the quiet here. The noise in this place is mostly useless." He nodded, unsure what else to say. She didn't offer a name, nor ask for his, but something in her gaze stayed with him long after his shift ended. Her name, he learned later, was Marcella Reed. 61 years old, widowed, no children. A former nurse who had retired early and donated half her estate to a literacy foundation before moving into Pine Ridge. She had suffered a fall in her kitchen and underwent surgery on her knee. Her rehabilitation brought her here, temporarily, she insisted. She had plans to leave as soon as she could walk without the aid of a walker. Not staying long enough to collect moss, she told Evan the second time they spoke, and certainly not long enough to become furniture. From that day forward, something shifted in his routine. He found himself taking his breaks near the recreation room, hoping she might be there. When she was, they talked. Not about the weather or the food. Those were topics for the bored and the bitter, but about books, music, memory. Marcella had lived in New Orleans for years, had worked trauma nights in Detroit, had traveled to Senegal before she was 30. She spoke with the authority of someone who had seen too much to pretend. "You're not like the others here," Evan said once, then winced at how it sounded. She laughed. "You mean I'm not waiting to die? You're right. I still have too many opinions." He liked that about her, that she didn't censor herself, that she spoke to him like he was more than just a young man in scrubs taking out trash. She asked questions no one else did. What he thought about race and religion, what his dreams were, what he feared. She listened, and she didn't try to fix his answers. Evan, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before. He told her about the pressure he felt from home, about the unspoken rules he lived by, about the guilt that clung to him whenever he tried to imagine a life different from the one designed for him. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered space. "Don't live someone else's apology," she said one day. "It won't make them love you more." They began to share routines. She would wait for him by the window in the late afternoons. He would bring her books from the university library. When he worked nights, she'd make him coffee from the little pot she hid in her room, claiming the nurse's station stuff was pale as ghosts and twice as bitter. Sometimes they sat in silence. Sometimes they argued about authors. Once, when he mentioned he had never read James Baldwin, she threw a pillow at him. In those moments, the age between them felt like fog, present but dissipating under the warmth of something growing. He didn't notice it at first. Not really. It came as comfort, familiarity, the kind that settles in your bones when you find someone who sees you, not for what you should be, but for what you are. One day, he found her in the courtyard, staring at a dying rose bush. She didn't greet him, just pointed. "They don't water it enough," she said. "Everything in this place gets ignored once it stops being easy." He bent beside her, reached for the hose, and gave the roots a deep soak. When he looked up, she was watching him with an expression that unsettled him, something between gratitude and grief. Her fingers brushed his shoulder as he stood. Brief, barely there, but enough. Later that night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering when the line between affection and longing had blurred. He told himself it was foolish, that it was temporary, that it was nothing. But he thought of her again the next day, and the day after that. And the ache in his chest said otherwise. If his feelings surprised him, they terrified him more. Not because of her age or her skin, but because of what people would say, what his parents would say, his church, his peers. It wasn't just taboo, it was heresy. But still, he went to her. Still, he stayed longer each night. Still, he watched her mouth when she spoke, memorized the lines around her eyes, found poetry in her laugh. And when she looked at him with that quiet knowing, he wondered if she felt it too. Neither of them said anything. Not yet. But in the silence between them, something undeniable was taking root. The rain that night had come softly, without warning, more amiss than a storm, settling over the town like a shroud of breath. Evan sat on the back steps of Pine Ridge, his jacket collar turned up, his eyes unfocused as the drizzle kissed his skin. The light from the corridor behind him cast a long rectangle of gold across the concrete, but he sat just outside it, as though the warmth might betray the thing he was trying to keep quiet inside himself. He had tried to stop thinking of her. Marcella. Her name had begun to echo differently in his mind, not just as a presence in his day, but as an absence in his night. It was there when he poured his cereal in the morning, when he walked past the downtown bookstore, when he sat in the back of lectures unable to hear anything but her voice from 2 days ago saying, "Don't live someone else's apology." He didn't know how it had become this. He didn't know when the comfort had twisted itself into longing, when admiration had slid sideways into desire, or why the thought of her alone in that room with the peeling wallpaper and the old, wheezing air conditioner made his chest ache in a way no woman his age ever had. He had tried to date girls from his program. Sweet, funny, polite, but all their questions had been surface level, all their laughter rehearsed. They talked about internships and fitness plans, family vacations and wedding Pinterest boards. None of them looked at him like he was real. None of them asked him what he feared most when the lights were out. Marcella did. He still remembered the moment it shifted, the first time he understood that what he felt could not be named with innocence. It had been a quiet Tuesday. She was sitting in the corner of the rec room with a stack of worn paperbacks, one of them spread open on her lap. Her reading glasses had slipped slightly down her nose, and she was mouthing the words as she turned the page. He had brought her a cup of peppermint tea. She accepted it without looking up. "You're becoming reliable," she murmured. "Careful, that's a dangerous reputation to earn." He sat beside her in the armchair with the loose armrest and watched the light from the window settle on her cheekbones. She looked regal, timeless, not diminished by age, but enhanced by it, like an old oak that refused to fall. She looked up then, caught him staring. He expected her to smirk or tease, but instead she held his gaze, and in that moment, the room disappeared. It was not romantic in the way stories make it sound. It was heavier than that. Something ancient. Something that tugged at a place in him too deep for language. Neither of them spoke. Later, when he returned home, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, his palms pressed together between his knees, and thought, "I'm not supposed to feel this." The next morning, he brought her a book. Giovanni's Room. She laughed low and rich and said, "Are you trying to break my heart, Evan?" "I think it's already broken," he replied without thinking. She looked at him then, really looked, and he thought perhaps she knew. She didn't ask what he meant. She just closed the book and said, "Come with me." That day, she led him to the garden behind the west wing where almost no residents ventured. The path was overgrown and cracked, but the benches were dry. They sat under a dogwood tree whose blossoms had just begun to wilt. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly. "When I was 20, I met a boy who smiled like you, only he didn't have your sadness. He was reckless, didn't last. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing." She tilted her head and added, "But you walk around like your soul's been wrapped in bandages." He wanted to ask her how she could see him so clearly. He wanted to tell her she was the only one who ever had. Instead, he reached for her hand. It was instinct, not calculation. Her fingers were warm, her skin soft but calloused in places, her knuckles lined with the soft folds of time. She didn't pull away. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy, full. She withdrew first, with care, and said, "We should go in. You'll get in trouble." But her voice trembled. From then on, everything changed. Quietly, slowly, like dusk settling over a field. They never spoke of what happened, but their conversations deepened. She asked about his mother, and when he hesitated, she didn't fill the gap. He asked about her late husband, and she told him about the way he cooked gumbo and never learned to fold laundry. They began to speak in memories. He started to come even on his days off. He told himself he was volunteering. Sometimes he read to her. Sometimes they played chess, and she always won. He grew bolder. He brushed lint from her sleeve. He held her elbow when she walked. Once, he touched her cheek to adjust her glasses, and she flinched, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. It wasn't sexual. Not yet. It was something purer, something rawer. He didn't know how to tell anyone. He didn't even know how to admit it fully to himself, but he wrote about it in the margins of his notebooks, lines he tore out before class, notes he folded and slipped between pages of Baldwin and Angelou and Lord. He dreamed of her smile, of waking to her voice. One afternoon, she wasn't in the rec room. A nurse said she was resting. He left a note. "Let me know when you want company." She didn't respond. He returned the next day. Still no sign. On the third day, he went to her room. She answered in a robe, her hair tied up in a scarf. She looked tired, but not unwell. "You shouldn't come here," she said softly. "Not like this." He didn't move. "I missed you," he said. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You don't know what you're doing." "Maybe not, but I know what I feel." She closed her eyes. "You're young. You think that matters more than it does." He shook his head. "You think age means you can't be loved." She opened her eyes, sharp and wet. "No, I think it means people won't let you be." He stepped forward, his hands at his sides. "Then let them not." The air between them snapped. She let him in. That night, they didn't kiss. They sat beside each other on the bed and listened to Coltrane on an old CD player. She told him about the summer her mother died, and he held her hand. When the music ended, he said, "I don't want to go." "Then don't," she replied, and he stayed. By morning, nothing had changed, and everything had. He walked the halls as if nothing had happened, but inside, he was split open. She didn't meet his eyes at first, but later, in the garden, she reached for his hand without words. They existed in secret, but it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like preservation. He began to imagine a future with her. Not a fantasy, not a dream, but a life. A small house, a porch, tea at sunrise, books at dusk. He wanted to introduce her to his world, but he knew what would happen. He knew his parents would accuse her of seduction. His church would condemn them. His friends would mock him. But he also knew that for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone in the world. He told her, one evening, as they sat beneath the dogwood again, "I've never loved anyone." She looked at him. "And you think you love me now?" "I know I do." She looked away. "It will cost you everything." He nodded. "Then it's worth it." They stayed like that until the stars came out. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The quiet between them said more than words ever could. The spring came early that year. In Georgia, that meant the air turned heavy with the scent of wisteria and honeysuckle, and every breeze carried a warmth that stuck to the skin like memory. At Pine Ridge, the windows remained shut and the curtains drawn, as though time itself refused to acknowledge the changing season. But for Evan and Marcella, something within them had begun to shift, something quiet but irreversible, like the tilt of the earth beneath a growing sun. They no longer pretended, not with each other. Not in the early mornings when Evan arrived before his shift just to bring her coffee in a worn thermos. Not in the way she saved the chair beside her. Not in the books they shared and the silences they lingered in. Their connection had become its own world. Private, wordless, steady. No one at the facility seemed to question it openly, though Evan had noticed the glances. The nurses didn't joke with him the way they used to. His supervisor started assigning him more distant rooms. A couple of aides whispered when they thought he wasn't looking. But no one dared say anything aloud, not yet. It didn't matter. Their time was precious and growing shorter. Marcella's physical therapy had progressed faster than expected. She had stopped using the walker entirely, and her name was now penciled into the discharge calendar for mid-April. She didn't say much about it. When Evan asked where she'd go, she only shrugged. "I have a little place outside of Macon," she said one afternoon. "It's nothing fancy, but it's mine." The thought of her leaving cracked something inside him. He had imagined many things, but not that. Not waking up one day and not seeing her sitting by the window, not hearing her laugh echo down the hallway, not feeling the magnetic pull of her presence even from across the building. He hadn't told her how deep it ran. He hadn't told her he'd imagined her name beside his in a lease, in a letter, on a doorbell. But that night, lying in his apartment, his hand resting on the book she had last touched, Evan understood something clearly. He didn't want to love her only in secret. He didn't want to be the hidden chapter in a life that deserved headlines. He didn't want to exist only between the lines. He wanted to bind himself to her in the only way that felt real, by making a promise. The ring wasn't expensive. He sold a few textbooks and used the last of his savings to buy a small vintage band with a garnet stone from a pawn shop near campus. It reminded him of her, elegant, unflashy, worn, and resilient. He kept it in his pocket for 3 days, trying to find the words, but every time he looked at her he found none that could hold what he felt. Finally, he stopped trying. On a Wednesday morning, as she sat beneath the cherry tree in the back courtyard, he walked up, knelt beside her, and placed the ring in her palm. Marcella stared at it, then at him. "What are you doing?" "I'm doing the only thing that feels right." Her eyes welled, but her face didn't move. "Evan, I'm 61. I know. I'm black, you're not. I know. I've lived twice your life." He smiled gently. "Then you know twice as much how rare this is." She didn't answer. She closed her hand around the ring and looked away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "People will hate you for this. They'll say I tricked you, that you've ruined your future." "Then let them say it," he replied. "But let them say it about my wife." The following week, they left Pine Ridge together. Her discharge papers were signed without ceremony. Evan took a leave of absence from school and told his professors he had family matters to attend to. They drove north to South Carolina, where marriage laws didn't require parental consent or waiting periods for adults. It was early evening when they arrived in the small town outside Charleston. The air smelled like salt and old earth. The justice of the peace was an elderly woman with silver braids and kind eyes who didn't ask questions. 2 women from the county clerk's office signed as witnesses. Marcella wore a lavender blouse and a skirt that reached her ankles. Evan wore the only suit he owned, a hand-me-down from his grandfather. They stood beneath a pale green arbor covered in climbing roses. The sun was low, casting gold across Marcella's face. When the officiant asked Evan if he would take Marcella to be his wife, he looked into her eyes and said, "Yes," with a calm that surprised even him. She paused when it came her turn. Her lips trembled, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I will." The ring fit perfectly. He had guessed the size. She smiled when he slid it on, a private smile, one that reached her soul and circled back. After the ceremony, they sat in the car parked outside a diner with cracked windows and faded signage. Evan held her hand as they watched the light shift in the sky. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. There was a stillness between them now, a certainty. It didn't last. They returned to Georgia 2 days later, not to Pine Ridge, but to Marcella's house, an old brick bungalow with ivy climbing the back porch and the smell of dust in the hallways. Evan called his parents from the front steps. His father answered. "I got married," Evan said. There was silence, then a sharp inhale. "To who?" "Marcella." The silence stretched. "She's black," his father said, as though he had been handed a verdict. "Yes." "She's older." "Yes." His father's voice hardened. "You've embarrassed this family. Your mother's crying. Your brother won't even speak your name. Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand that I'm happy," Evan said. The call ended with a click. No goodbye. 3 days later, his bank account was frozen. His tuition reimbursement was revoked. His mother blocked his number. His childhood best friend texted, "Bro, what are you doing?" At first, Evan tried to ignore it. He and Marcella settled into their little home, trying to carve peace from the wreckage. She cooked, he cleaned. They planted herbs in the garden, but the outside world did not stay outside. One afternoon, a rock smashed their window. No one saw who threw it, but the note wrapped around it read, "You don't belong here." Another day, a neighbor muttered, "Shameful," as they passed. Evan received an email from his university's administration. His conduct had raised serious concerns about judgment and professionalism. His professors, once mentors, now avoided him. Marcella bore it all with the same quiet dignity she had always shown. But Evan began to see the cost, in the way she sometimes lingered in doorways, in how she touched her wedding band like a wound, in the way she said his name too softly, as though afraid he might someday leave. He held her closer. They didn't regret what they had done, but they felt the weight of it. They clung to the ordinary. Grocery shopping, morning coffee, evening walks, holding hands on the sofa while the television murmured nonsense. And then, one quiet Sunday morning, Marcella stood in the bathroom staring at a white plastic stick, her fingers trembling. 2 pink lines. Evan found her sitting on the edge of the tub, the test in her lap. "I didn't think this could happen," she whispered. Neither did he, but it had, and everything was about to change again. The silence that filled the bathroom was unlike any Evan had known. It wasn't the silence of sleep or solitude or even grief. It was denser, more alert, the kind of silence that hummed with something unspoken yet seismic. Marcella sat motionless, her elbows resting on her knees, the pregnancy test balanced loosely between her fingers. Her eyes weren't focused on it anymore. They stared ahead at the tiled wall as if searching for a crack that might explain what had just happened. Her lips were parted, but no sound came. Evan knelt before her, still in the flannel pants and white t-shirt he slept in, his own breath trapped somewhere beneath his ribs. He wasn't sure what he felt. Disbelief, yes, but beyond that, something else. Something wild and impossible. Something like awe. She was 61. She had told him, laughing once, that she'd gone through menopause almost a decade ago. She had described herself as a closed factory with rusted equipment, brushing away any suggestion that a child was even remotely possible. And yet, here they were, caught in the middle of a miracle neither of them had asked for, but which now sat like a spark in the center of their small, shared life. Marcella broke the silence first. "This isn't real," she whispered, the words barely above breath. It can't be. Evan gently took the test from her hand, double-checked the lines as if that might change them, but the second pink stripe was still there, faint but steady, unmoving in its certainty. He reached for her other hand and held it tightly. "Let's go to the clinic," he said. "Let's be sure." The drive to the Women's Health Center was quiet, the roads unusually empty for a Monday. The radio stayed off. Evan drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw clenched and eyes forward. Marcella sat with her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed out the passenger side window. She said nothing as they entered the waiting room, filled out the forms, and sat in the stiff plastic chairs under fluorescent lights. The nurse called her name. She disappeared through the swinging door, and Evan waited. The minutes stretched unbearably. He stared at a poster about prenatal vitamins, at a dusty fake plant in the corner, at a teenage girl across the room who was obviously trying not to cry. The world felt surreal, like he had stepped out of his life and into someone else's, someone braver or more foolish. When Marcella returned, her face was unreadable. She sat beside him and exhaled through her nose. Her hands were shaking. "It's confirmed," she said. Evan felt his stomach drop, then lift. "How far?" 6 weeks. He reached for her hand again. She let him hold it, but she didn't squeeze back. In the days that followed, the weight of what this meant settled over them like the Georgia heat, slow, sticky, inescapable. Marcella moved through the house in a daze. She was quiet during meals, restless at night, her fingers constantly brushing over her lower abdomen, as if to check that the life inside her was still real. Evan did what he could. He cooked, he read articles, he searched for case studies on late-age pregnancy, desperate for reassurance. Most of them didn't offer much. Risks were high, complications likely, but none of them said impossible. And that, he decided, was enough. He wanted to tell the world. Part of him wanted to shout it from the rooftop, to declare to everyone who had ever doubted them that they were building something real, something sacred. But Marcella wasn't ready. She barely seemed to believe it herself. Then the world found out anyway. It started with a receptionist at the clinic, a woman in her 40s with thin lips and eyes that never lifted from her computer screen. She had glanced at the chart, at Marcella, at Evan, then again at the chart. Her brows raised slightly. She said nothing, but something in her expression had changed, just enough for suspicion to bloom. 2 days later, a blog post appeared on a local gossip site. The headline read, "College student knocked up a granny?" The article was brief, cruel, and unverified. It referenced an interracial couple from Milledgeville, a woman in her 60s, and a suspicious pregnancy test. Within hours, the post was shared dozens of times. Comments poured in. Some were confused, most were mocking, a few were furious. Evan's phone buzzed non-stop. He had changed numbers after leaving school, but someone had found his social media. Photos of him and Marcella, taken months earlier, shared innocently, were now circulating with captions like, "When your mom becomes your baby mama," and student loans got him marrying AARP members. The worst was yet to come. News spread quickly in Milledgeville. His parents found out almost immediately. His father left him a voicemail that started calm and spiraled into a sermon, quoting scripture about sin and deception. His mother didn't speak, but the sound of her crying in the background was audible. His older brother texted him once, "Is this really who you are now?" Strangers began sending messages, threats, derision, accusations that Marcella had manipulated him, that he was mentally ill, that the whole thing was some kind of scam. One person suggested that the child didn't exist at all, that it was a ploy for attention or money. Another offered money if Evan came to his senses and divorced her. Marcella stopped leaving the house. She sat for hours on the couch, one hand on her belly, the television playing quietly. Sometimes Evan found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap, eyes vacant. "I knew they'd come for you," she said one night. "I just didn't know it would hurt this much to watch." "They haven't won," Evan replied. "They don't have to," she said. "They only have to make you doubt." He didn't, not for a second. But the walls closed in nonetheless. A brick was thrown through their window, again. This time with a note attached, "You're an embarrassment to God and country." The police came and took a statement, but nothing came of it. They received a notice from the Homeowners Association claiming their presence and conduct had created disharmony in the neighborhood. They were asked to consider relocating for the good of the community. Marcella was followed once, returning from a doctor's appointment. A car with tinted windows tailed her for 3 miles, only pulling away after she stopped in front of a police station. Evan began to sleep with a baseball bat near the bed. Despite it all, the pregnancy progressed. Marcella's first ultrasound showed a strong heartbeat. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with soft hands and a no-nonsense tone, looked at them without judgment. "Unusual," she said. "Yes, but not unheard of. She's healthy. Baby's healthy. That's what matters." Evan cried in the parking lot. Marcella, for the first time in weeks, laughed. "Stop it," she said, wiping his face. "You're embarrassing the baby." They returned home and found graffiti on their garage door. "Witch plus child abuser equals sign freak show." Marcella stood in front of it for a long time. Then she went inside and started packing. That night, they didn't argue. Evan didn't ask where they were going. He simply helped fold clothes and wrap dishes. They loaded everything into his old truck, covered it with a tarp, and left before dawn. They drove south, toward the coast, away from the town that had once been his whole world and now felt like a cage. The sky was pale blue, the road empty. Marcella leaned her head against the window, one hand resting over her stomach. Evan reached for her free hand. "I still choose this," he said. She didn't speak, but her fingers squeezed his. In the rearview mirror, the town faded behind them. Ahead, only the road and the future, whatever it held. The sun was barely above the horizon when they reached the edge of the small town that would become their new hiding place. It was the kind of place that didn't make it onto maps unless you squinted or zoomed in 3 times. An old fishing community off the Florida Panhandle with weathered houses, sagging porches, and streets that turned to mud when it rained. There were no neon signs or shopping malls here, only bait shops, corner stores, and a single church that doubled as a hurricane shelter. For Evan and Marcella, it was perfect. It was anonymous. And more than anything, it was quiet. The house they found stood just beyond the town's center, if such a term could even be applied. It was owned by a retired shrimp boat captain who didn't ask for references or paperwork, just cash up front and a promise not to make trouble. The place was small, a 1-bedroom structure with sun-bleached siding and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. The inside smelled of salt and age, and the floorboards groaned like they'd been waiting decades to be noticed again. But there was light in the windows and breeze off the water, and when Evan looked at Marcella standing there, her hand resting on her growing belly, he knew it would do. They unpacked in silence. There wasn't much to bring. A few boxes of clothes, 2 suitcases, Marcella's notebooks, and the stack of medical records now thicker than a phone book. They set up the bedroom sparsely. A mattress on the floor, 2 milk crates for nightstands, a reading lamp that flickered when turned on. The kitchen worked barely. Evan tested the stove while Marcella arranged her vitamins on the windowsill above the sink. That first night, they didn't talk much. The weight of what they'd left behind hung in the air like humidity. Marcella sat in the single armchair by the front window, her legs elevated on a footstool. Evan had found beside the dumpster out back. Her eyes were heavy, her body worn. Evan cooked rice and beans, the only ingredients they had. He brought the plate to her with a spoon and a folded napkin. She looked at him, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just touched his wrist and said, "You're too good for this." He kissed the top of her head and said, "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." In the days that followed, they tried to build a life from the bones of what they had left. Evan found work at a garage on the edge of town, owned by a man named Luis who didn't care about resumes and didn't ask about the past. The work was honest, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to get by. But Evan came home every night with grease on his hands and a sense of purpose in his chest. Marcella stayed home. The nearest prenatal clinic was nearly an hour away, and they couldn't afford weekly visits. She walked when she could, rested when she needed to, and kept a journal on the coffee table where she documented each flutter and change in her body. Her belly swelled slowly but surely. At 20 weeks, the baby kicked for the first time. She placed Evan's hand over the spot, and they sat still for nearly an hour, waiting for it to happen again. They didn't speak of Milledgeville, not of the family who had turned away, or the neighbors who had cursed them, or the graffiti that still haunted Evan's dreams. They didn't speak of the blog posts or the reporters who had left voicemails, or the silence from the university that had quietly erased him from the student directory. They didn't speak of the threat Marcella had sensed behind the wheel of that car that had followed her. Some things, once named, became too real, but forgetting was never truly possible. Rumors found ways of traveling. Even in this remote town, whispers eventually caught the wind. A cashier at the corner store asked Evan if he was that kid from the internet. A nurse at the local clinic looked at Marcella with a flicker of recognition. A teenage boy on a skateboard snapped a photo of Evan as he walked home from work. Then came the day of the market. Marcella had insisted on going. She said she wanted fresh fruit, that she couldn't stomach canned peaches anymore. Evan offered to go alone, but she shook her head. "I need the sun," she said. "I need to be part of something living." They walked together, hand in hand, through the stalls set up along the waterfront. The ocean glimmered behind them, calm and endless. They picked tomatoes, sampled honey, bought a small loaf of sourdough. For a brief time, it felt normal, until Evan saw the man. Hung back near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, sunglasses on, a hat pulled low. He was unmistakable. A cousin on his mother's side. The same one who'd laughed at his wedding photo in the group chat, the one who'd called Marcella a parasite. Their eyes met. The cousin turned and disappeared into the crowd. Evan's stomach dropped. He didn't say anything to Marcella. That night, their porch light went out. The next day, their mailbox was pried open. The day after, a dead fish was left on their doorstep. Marcella said nothing, but Evan saw the change in her. She stopped taking walks. She kept the curtains drawn. She began locking the bathroom door when she showered. Then came the truck. It happened late in the afternoon. Marcella had come to the garage to bring Evan lunch, 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil, still warm. She waited under the awning in a folding chair with her feet up, sipping water from a mason jar. Evan had stepped inside to grab a towel when he heard her scream. He ran outside just in time to see the pickup barreling toward her, wheels shrieking as it tore down the narrow lane. Time slowed. The engine roared. Marcella froze. Evan lunged. They hit the ground together, rolled hard across the gravel. The truck swerved at the last second and sped away without stopping. No license plate, no words, just dust and exhaust and the lingering sound of Marcella's ragged breath. She was shaking. Her hand clutched her stomach. Evan held her for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The police came, took statements, said there wasn't much they could do. No plate, no proof, one officer said. Could have been a drunk. Evan didn't believe that for a second. That night, Marcella sat in the dark, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "They want to hurt us," she whispered. Evan couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, his fists clenched, the taste of metal in his mouth. He had never known fury like this, not as a child, not as a student, not even when his family had turned away. This was deeper, older. It came from somewhere primal. Marcella joined him just before dawn, her robe loose over her shoulders. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from silent tears. "You should leave," she said. "No. They'll kill you too. I don't care. You should." "I won't." He stood, pulled her close, pressed his forehead to hers. "You're my family now," he whispered. "If I run from you, I run from myself." The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from Ty, the only friend who hadn't vanished entirely. 5 words. "Be careful. Hung is planning something." It didn't surprise Evan, but it made the danger real. From that day on, Marcella never stayed home alone. She came with him to work, sat under the awning, her hand resting on her stomach, her eyes scanning the horizon. She watched him with pride and fear in equal measure. Fear had a way of turning even quiet days into battlegrounds. It lurked in the spaces between breaths, in the shadows beneath doors, in the way strangers paused before speaking. But Evan had made a choice. And Marcella, with every breath, with every flutter of the child within her, reminded him why. They had already lost everything. They weren't about to lose each other. It began, as things often do, not with a bang, but with a phone call. The sky outside was the color of slate, clouds stretching low and heavy over the coastal town, and Evan was just beginning to doze in the chair beside their narrow bed. Marcella lay beneath a knitted blanket, her body curved protectively around her belly, her breathing shallow but steady. She had barely slept since the truck incident, and Evan had refused to leave her side for more than a few minutes at a time. The silence in the house had grown thick, almost sacred, broken only by the distant rustle of the sea beyond their window. Then the phone vibrated on the nightstand. Evan startled awake. He grabbed the phone and glanced at the screen. It was his mother. He hadn't heard from her in nearly 5 months, not since the voicemail his father had left, not since the accounts were frozen and his name effectively erased from the family records. His heart skipped, then slammed. He answered without speaking. Her voice was thin, unfamiliar in its weakness. "She's in the hospital," she said. "They called me." It took him a moment to find his own voice. "What happened?" Her blood pressure, it spiked. They think it was stress. Hung was there this morning. He said things, threats. Evan didn't wait to hear more. He ended the call, gently woke Marcella, and within 10 minutes they were in the car, heading north. The drive took 6 hours. Evan didn't speak for most of it. His hands locked on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it throbbed. Marcella dozed beside him, waking every so often to sip water or shift in her seat. The farther they got from the coast, the more the air seemed to thicken. By the time they crossed into Baldwin County, it felt like breathing through gauze. The hospital was small, tucked between 2 churches and a shuttered grocery store. Evan parked in a visitor spot and helped Marcella out of the car. She moved slowly now, her steps more deliberate. At 27 weeks, her center of gravity had shifted, and she carried herself with the cautious grace of someone aware that every motion could be a test. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone in the shades of beige. They found his mother in room 114, propped up in bed with a nasal cannula and an IV drip. Her hair, once rigidly maintained, had grayed at the roots and frizzed at the ends. Her hands, always so precise in their movements, now trembled slightly as she reached for her rosary. When she saw Evan, she began to cry. He approached slowly. Marcella lingered near the doorway, uncertain. "They're tearing you away from me," his mother said. "That boy hung. He came in yelling, accusing. I didn't even know what to say." Evan sat beside her and took her hand. "You don't have to fight them," he said softly. "Just don't fight me." For a long moment she said nothing. Then her gaze flickered toward Marcella, who stood with her hands folded, her expression unreadable. "If my son chooses you," she said at last, her voice almost brittle, "then I won't stop him, but I don't know how to face them." Evan didn't argue. He only nodded. "Then let me do it for you." The next morning, he returned to the ancestral house alone. It stood at the end of a dirt road, set back from the highway by a stretch of untamed grass and ancient oaks that reached towards the sky like twisted prayers. The house had been in the Holloway family for generations, a place of baptisms and funerals, weddings and reckonings. Evan had attended countless Sunday dinners here as a boy, had once learned to ride a bike on the gravel drive, had memorized the creaks in the floorboards and the smell of pine from the kitchen cabinets. But today, it felt like foreign territory. He stepped inside without knocking. The room was already full. A semicircle of folding chairs had been arranged in the parlor, and nearly every seat was occupied. Aunts in wide-brimmed hats, uncles in collared shirts, cousins he hadn't seen in years. All of them turned to stare as he entered. No one smiled. At the center of the room sat Cocoa Holloway, his grandfather, patriarch of the family, now 85 and sharp as ever. His cane rested across his knees, and his gaze was heavy with the weight of legacy. "You came," the old man said. Evan nodded. "Alone. For now." There was a long pause. Then Cocoa leaned forward. "Do you come here with shame?" "No." "You bring a woman who could be your grandmother. You tell us she's carrying your child. Do you not care about your ancestors, about the dignity of this family?" Evan bowed his head. When he looked up again, his eyes were steady. "I care. About her, about our child, about doing what's right." Cocoa's cane struck the floor with a crack. "Not in this house," he said. "If you insist on keeping that child and that woman, then you are no longer one of us. You are cut off." Gasps rippled through the room. Uncle Bar stood. "Let her get rid of it," he said, his voice rising, "or get out." Evan stepped forward. "This baby is innocent." "You dishonor us," another cousin said. "You've been cursed," someone muttered. "She cast a spell," said an aunt. "She's using you," someone else hissed. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He turned and left. Marcella was waiting in the car. When he slid into the seat beside her, she said nothing, but he saw the tears in her eyes. "You've lost everything because of me," she whispered. He shook his head. "You and our baby are everything. I didn't lose a thing." They spent that night at a friend's house on the outskirts of town, a former classmate of Evan's who still remembered him fondly and owed him a favor. The place was small but safe. They didn't sleep. They held each other in the dark, their fingers laced, the baby shifting gently between them. But the worst had not passed. The next morning, a knock came at the door. It was Ty. He looked pale, anxious. "I heard something," he said. "Hung and Bar, they're planning something. I don't know what, but it's not good." Evan felt the chill move through him like a shiver of ice. "We have to go," he told Marcella. She didn't argue. They packed quickly. Just clothes, medicine, documents. They left through the back, cut through a neighbor's field, and were gone before anyone could follow. They fled in silence, Marcella gripping his hand, Evan glancing in the mirror every few minutes. Behind them was blood. Ahead was fire. But they drove on, because love, once chosen, must be defended. Not only against enemies, but sometimes against the family that taught you how to pray. The rains arrived earlier than expected that year. They came not as gentle drizzles or passing spring showers, but as long, drumming symphonies that stretched for days, washing the dust from rooftops, turning roads to streams, and coating the world in a kind of shimmering gray. In the small coastal town where Evan and Marcella had first fled months earlier, the rain was a soft drumbeat against the roof of their borrowed house, an unending whisper that wrapped itself around every corner. It was the sound of waiting, of breath held between storms, of hearts caught in limbo. The house had grown quieter, more fragile in its stillness. Marcella no longer moved with ease. Her back ached constantly now, and her ankles swelled after only a few minutes of standing. She would rest on the sofa for hours, a pillow tucked behind her, one hand always settled across her stomach. Sometimes her eyes followed the pattern of raindrops down the window glass. Other times she stared at nothing at all. Evan stayed close, his movements gentle, always listening. He had grown leaner, wearier. Each morning he still went to the garage, but he left later and came home earlier, determined never to be too far for too long. Every day he kissed Marcella's forehead before leaving, as if to reassure himself she would still be there when he returned. Their world had narrowed to a handful of streets, a faded grocery list, and the soft thud of the baby's kicks. They spoke in whispers, both out of caution and exhaustion. But under the surface, tension swelled, less about fear and more about time. The baby would be here soon. They had not yet been allowed to breathe. Whispers continued to circle them, though the cousins' threats had not materialized again, not openly. There was a change in the way strangers looked at them in town. Conversations paused when they entered stores. A few familiar faces no longer offered nods. Marcella noticed it too. She had stopped going to the market. Even her walks along the waterfront had ceased. Her world had condensed into the perimeter of the porch and the far end of the living room where the light was warmest in the morning. She smiled when Evan read to her, when he played old jazz records while washing dishes. But some days, when she thought he wasn't looking, he caught her staring at the floor with a kind of grief that frightened him. "What if our child is born into hate?" she asked one evening, her voice barely louder than the rain against the window. "What if we can't protect him?" Evan didn't answer at once. He took her hand, kissed her fingertips one by one, and pressed her palm against his heart. "Then we'll teach him to rise above it," Like you. Like us. But even he wasn't sure it was enough. 2 days later, another message arrived from Ty, slipped beneath the garage door while Evan worked. Written in hurried pencil, it read, "Hung is still talking. They want to do something public. To shame you. They think if they humiliate you, you'll disappear." Evan read it twice, then folded it slowly and slipped it into his pocket. That night, he didn't mention it to Marcella, but he watched her as she slept, the baby shifting beneath the thin fabric of her nightgown, and he understood that they had waited long enough. The next morning, he told her everything. About the new threats, about the rumors of a family decree, about the whispers of excommunication, about the plan to shame them not with fists or force, but with condemnation dressed in tradition. "We have to face them," he said, "before they twist this story into something ugly again, before our child arrives." Marcella looked up at him with tired eyes. "You think they'll listen?" "No," he said, "but they'll see." And so they returned once more, not to plead, not to apologize, but to confront the truth in full daylight. Marcella dressed simply for the occasion, a faded green IO dye that flowed gently over her belly. Her hair was pulled back in a soft bun, and she wore no makeup, no jewelry. Her face was bare, her expression resolute. Evan wore a clean white shirt and black slacks. His hands trembled as he buttoned the cuffs, but his spine was straight. They drove in silence. When they reached the outskirts of Milledgeville, the roads seemed to narrow, the trees to lean in. The ancestral house loomed at the end of the lane, unchanged. The same porch with the creaking step, the same weather-worn shutters. But the air was different now, charged. The courtyard was already full. Word had spread. Aunts and uncles, cousins who had long abandoned family dinners, former friends, even old church members, they had all gathered, not to celebrate, to bear witness. At the center stood Kokoa, stiff and upright beside the family altar, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes were closed as they approached. A hush fell over the crowd. Evan stepped forward, holding Marcella's hand. Her grip was firm. He bowed deeply, then raised his voice, calm but certain. "I've come today not for permission, not to beg, but to speak the truth. We are not hiding, we are not ashamed, we are family, by blood, by choice, by love. If you want to deny us, do it now, but do it with your eyes open." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, slowly from the back of the crowd, a figure emerged. His mother. Supported by Ty, she stepped forward, her gait slow but purposeful. She looked at her son, then at Marcella. Her face bore the signs of grief, of fear, of struggle. But when she spoke, her voice was clear. "I was wrong," she said. "I let fear speak louder than love. But this woman, she has given my son what no one else could. Loyalty, peace, a home. I will not lose him again." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some gasped. Some looked away. Others clutched their crosses or their coats. Then Kokoa raised one hand. Silence returned. He looked at Marcella, and for the first time, really looked. Perhaps it was the curve of her stomach. Perhaps the way she stood, not with arrogance but with dignity. Perhaps it was something older, some whisper of his own humanity that refused to be snuffed out. "I'm old," he said. "I have seen war, famine. I have buried brothers, wives, children. And I know now that legacy is not built on control. It is built on survival." "You love him?" Marcella nodded once. "More than my own life." He turned to Evan. "And you will protect her, even when it costs you everything?" "I already have," Evan replied. Kokoa turned back to the gathering. "Then let no one speak against them again," he said. "What's done is done. This child is ours." The words fell like thunder. Some cousins stormed out. Others wept openly, but no one dared challenge him. Marcella's knees buckled, and Evan caught her just in time. She clung to him, her breath ragged. I thought they would never see me." He smiled through tears. "They don't have to. I see you. That's enough." Back in Tumkai, the rain had lifted. The skies split into fragile light. Marcella sat on the porch beside Evan, her legs up, the baby quiet for now. They watched the clouds break apart like smoke. His mother visited often now. She brought warm tea, steamed rice, small folded towels. Sometimes she and Marcella sat together in silence, no longer adversaries, not quite family, but something new. In August, Marcella went into labor. The storm returned that night. The roads were slick and dark, and Evan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other clasping Marcella's trembling fingers. She cried out with each contraction, her body bent by pain, but unyielding in spirit. The hospital was small, underfunded, but the staff worked swiftly, gently. Hours passed, then more. At dawn, as the first light painted the world in blues and grays, a cry broke through the room. A son. They named him Min, meaning light. Evan held him in shaking arms, tears streaking his cheeks, his breath caught between sobs. "You made it," he whispered. "You made it through everything." Marcella lay back against the pillow, her face pale but smiling, her hand reaching for their child. "He's perfect," she murmured. Word spread, but this time the world answered differently. Neighbors brought herbs, small jars of ointment, old toys wrapped in scarves. Even Kokoa sent a red envelope with golden coins and a note. Family is not always chosen, but it must be honored. A month later, Evan made a decision. He would not raise men in hiding. He would marry Marcella again, publicly, in the light. The wedding took place beside the Tubon River, where they had once stood breathless in the dark, running from hate. Now they returned not in fear, but in celebration. Madame Holloway helped plan everything. Ty cooked. Some aunts came with casseroles and soft apologies. Others simply watched from afar. Marcella wore white, silver threads woven into the fabric. Her hair was down. Min slept nearby, swaddled in a basket. Evan stood beside her, heart full. They exchanged vows beneath the orange sky, the river at their backs, the wind gentle and sweet, and, as it swept over them carrying memory and miracle and hope, Marcella whispered, "We did it." Evan, his voice low, his eyes full, answered, "Love always finds a way." And somewhere, beyond the hush of trees and the hush of grief, a name rode the wind. Min, the name of light, the name of a beginning. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to see it. And don't forget to watch the next story.